Thank you for your interest in joining me here this afternoon. Allow me to start firstly by conveying my heartfelt thanks to the people and government of Uganda for the generous welcome my delegation and I have received. And allow me to also extend my sincere congratulations to the government of Uganda for successfully hosting the 19th Non-Aligned Movement Summit, as well as the 3rd South Summit, which of course will open tomorrow. I wish them every success in chairing these two important groups, whose rich and diverse character from the Global South is so critical to the UN system and to multilateralism as a whole, as NAM represents 55% of the global population, and the Group of 77 in China is the largest negotiating bloc of developing countries in the United Nations system. And I must say that I'm very proud that it was on these two occasions that I'm undertaking my very first official visit to Africa as President of the United Nations General Assembly for its 78th session. Yesterday morning, we opened the 19th Summit of the Non-Aligned Movement, held under the theme Deepening Cooperation for Shared Global Affluence, which concluded this afternoon. And tomorrow morning, we will attend the 3rd South Summit organized by the Group of 77 in China under the banner Leaving No One Behind. In my address to the openings of both forums, I used the occasion to reiterate my appreciation for both organizations whose support to my presidency has proven immensely useful during very challenging times. The current climate, and I mean this politically and literally, the current global climate is marked by profound instability, and our multilateral system is on trial. High-level gatherings like these are an occasion for leaders of the Global South to demonstrate that cooperation and collaboration are not only still possible, but are in fact indispensable. They constitute the sole credible course of action to authentically and meaningfully address the depth and breadth of the challenges we face. Indeed, it is only a cohesive international community that we stand a chance through a cohesive international community that we stand a chance of succeeding. In a time of unprecedented crisis, far too often the voices of the Global South and of developing countries are relegated to the margins and peripheries. This is not acceptable, either politically or morally. In fact, I am absolutely convinced that both the Non-Aligned Movement and the Group of 77 in China are key drivers and influencers of peace, progress, prosperity, and sustainability, all of which are priorities of my presidency. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening, on the occasion of his newfound chairmanship of both groups, I will have the honor of paying a courtesy call on His Excellency Mr. Yoweri Museveni, the President of the Republic of Uganda. I was also very privileged to meet with the Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, the UN country team, and the resident coordinator for Uganda, as well as other bilateral engagements. In all my meetings, I addressed a range of pressing global issues, including climate change, sustainable development, peace and security, and of course, human rights. I also made sure to communicate the work ongoing in New York, including invitations to upcoming events such as the Summit of the Future and my presidency's signature event, Sustainability Week, in April. Today, I also undertook several field visits around the capital city of Kampala. In fact, I'm just back from said visits. In terms of migration, My visits included UN-operated programs such as the UNHCR's Urban Response Initiative in Naisamba and IOM's Kampala Transit Center in Nakasero. Regarding education, I visited Nakivubo Blue Primary School and their Girls Empowering Girls program, which they run with UNICEF. I also had the chance to visit Makerere University, where I was introduced to Makerere University's Multidisciplinary Innovation Pod, conducting research on digital innovation and urbanization in partnership with the United Nations Development Program. Finally, on women's and girls' rights, I was welcomed into the offices of the Saudi Helplines Center, where I saw the incredible work to counter gender-based violence, child labor, neglect, and abuse. It was a truly eye-opening experience and a privilege I do not take for granted to have had the chance to witness firsthand the work being spearheaded in Uganda by the various entities under the United Nations umbrella. I am very proud of that work. To complement these extensive visits tomorrow afternoon, I will participate in a roundtable session with the heads of UN agencies present in the country, to be moderated by the resident coordinator, which I eagerly anticipate. As I conclude, this visit is part of a broader effort to underscore the UN's dedication and commitment to ensuring a more prosperous and harmonious world that is inclusive of the Global South. I'm confident that this trip will have served that purpose. My door is open to any nation or leader desiring to engage in further cooperation across borders, sectors, or UN departments. Together, we can deliver on peace, we can deliver on prosperity, we can deliver on progress, and we can deliver on sustainability. And I'm glad to have shared this message to both the government and people of Uganda, as well as all those present for these two summits. Thank you for your kind attention, and I now open the floor for your questions and/or observations.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Can we have questions? Let's start with Arati, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. My name is Benga Aboro. I'm from RT, Russia today. Now, Your Excellency, one of the major issues that was discussed at this 19th non-aligned summit was the ongoing Israeli aggression in Gaza. How is the United Nations actively addressing and seeking solutions to this conflict? And also conflicts with humanitarian implications around the world. And how does the organization plan to enhance its effectiveness, adaptability, and responsiveness to contemporary global issues? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's have the second one.
Mr. President, thank you very much.
Your name and the media house.
My name is Kana Rukume from NBS TV Uganda. Particularly seeking for your response on conflict. Most of the times when the UN does respond on conflict, it does talk about Palestine or even Ukraine. There's so much conflicts happening in Africa, Central African Republic, Mozambique, Somalia, Burkina Faso, Mali, and many other countries, including the Sudan situation. What's your take on the conflicts happening in Africa, and what is now going to do to make sure that at least it takes a stand in some of these conflicts in Africa?
Thank you. Can we have, let's have a lady.
Security Council. However, updated efforts have not been successful. So I'm inquiring how far with granting this, or should we be hopeful that this will be granted? Thank you.
Your Excellency, possibly you can answer those three, then we can take three more.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. I think the first question related to specifically to the situation in Gaza and about what the UN, how does the UN plan to adapt itself to be more impactful in resolving complex global issues. The first thing I want to say is that the UN is not the problem. The UN is not the problem. The UN seeks to be, sometimes to lead, but always to support the solution. So let's get that out of the way. Let's get that clear. The UN is not an actor in creating problems for the international system. The UN was set up as a problem solver to facilitate dialogue, discussion, compromise, agreement, understanding that leads to resolutions of conflicts. The situation in Gaza is an extremely frustrating one. I think you know why. 25,000 innocent civilian lives lost. It's a very impressive number for the wrong reasons. It's impressive because it is woefully and unacceptably large that so many innocent people who are not themselves combatants should be the victims of the military action taking place in Gaza. And that is why the General Assembly, which I have the honor to lead, and I am here, I am sitting here, but I'm the voice and the face of the General Assembly. And that General Assembly was swift in agreeing a resolution that called for, number one, the immediate return of all hostages as a consequence of the unacceptable action that was taken by Hamas on October 7th, the cessation of the violence in Gaza in order to save lives. At the time we had made that call, I think the death toll was less than, it was about 7,000 people, the majority of whom were in fact women and children, young children, innocent children. And the third thing was to insist that the authorities, the Israeli authorities, permit and facilitate access of humanitarian aid to those in Gaza who needed it. So that was maybe, if one could use the descriptor, 6,000 or 7,000 lives ago. Today, it's in excess of 25,000 lives. That number has more than multiplied itself 4 times. And that's precisely the reason why the General Assembly delivered this very strong message that the violence must come to an end, because we saw the danger and the risk that many more innocent lives would be lost in a situation that threatened to become a spiral of death and destruction, which is precisely what has happened. As it stands at the moment, with no immediate end in sight to the hostilities in Gaza, it's anyone's guess what can and might happen next, including, of course, the worrisome prospect that this can all spill over into a regional war, a regional engagement, which of course would be the worst possible scenario that can happen. The other part of the question that was asked was how the UN plans to adapt itself in order to address more effectively global issues. But I think we need first, there's an answer to that question. But there is also, I think, the necessity of dissecting the origins of some of these conflicts and disputes. Conflicts and disputes create strife and tension in the system. The parties to those conflicts make a choice. They make a decision. There was a decision made to invade Ukraine. There was a decision made by Hamas, albeit not without provocation, of domination of Gaza for an extraordinary long period of time. But there was a decision made by Hamas on October 7th, and a consequential decision made by the State of Israel in response. Conflict and crisis and war are decisions. They're not necessarily inescapable decisions. There could have been other decisions. There could have been decisions for dialogue, for negotiation, in several rounds. That did not happen. The point I'm making is, war and peace are decisions that countries make for reasons best known to themselves. It is not the decision that the UN expounds and promotes for the very reasons we're seeing in Gaza. Because it's painful, it's dastardly, it's dehumanizing, it's destructive. Think for 1 minute of what it would cost. Let's for a moment, if we could, and in a sense we shouldn't, but if you, for 1 minute, just set aside the human cost of the war in terms of the lives, the 25,000 people. Think for 1 minute what it would cost to rebuild Ukraine. And what it might mean for the entire global economy and for global development in having to rebuild Ukraine and having to rebuild Gaza. Think for a moment. The United Nations Charter says we the people, in order to save future generations from the scourge of war. That is what the UN is about. Because we've been down this road before in the First and Second World Wars. There are no real winners. There are no winners. There are only losers, setbacks. Setbacks that undermine development, derail people's lives, impose costs and suffering on human beings. Create dysfunction in societies, impose new problems, new burdens on families. Can you imagine? 80% of the households in Gaza have been destroyed and are now uninhabitable. Where are these people to live? And under what protection from the environment, from the elements? So there's a logic to the UN position. Let's avoid this carnage because it's self-destructive. No one wins. We all lose. We all lose a part of our humanity watching other human beings suffer. It was never intended that way. What is the UN doing in order to empower itself to better address these challenges? The UN is not complacent or arrogant about its role and function and its capacity to meet the demands of the challenges that exist. In fact, the UN is very much a reformist organization. One of the issues, and it's a big issue, it's a huge issue, that has been dramatically demonstrated, particularly in relation to the war in Ukraine and to the war in Gaza, is the apparent incapacity of the United Nations Security Council, which has, under the Charter, primary responsibility for international peace and security. The incapacity of the Charter to act, to take the decisions that are necessary to be taken, that could politically alter the course of events. And the Security Council, because of deep divisions globally, geopolitical divisions, had not for a very long time been able to reach a decision, a consensus on Gaza. In the meantime, the death toll had been climbing. The UN itself, let us not forget that UN personnel amounting to, I think, 155 souls have been lost in Gaza. And UN workers assigned to Gaza to provide humanitarian aid and support many of them were taking their children to work, their young children to work with them out of fear that if they should die, their families would die with them. They did not want to be separated from their children because bombs were being dropped on UN facilities, contrary to the provisions and dictates of international law, contrary to the principles of international humanitarian law. Those are supposed to be safe spaces, as indeed are places like hospitals, health centers, schools. But the evidence seems to suggest that the nature of these facilities did not form part of the calculus in the bombing campaign that has taken place in Gaza. So you have the largest number of UN personnel killed in any military action anywhere in the world in the history of the UN. So Security Council reform is underway. I want to say to you, though, that Security Council reform is a process. It's not an event. I'm a very practical guy. And so I'd say to you, don't expect to get up to awaken Monday morning and find that the Security Council has been reformed. It will not happen in that way. And it shouldn't. It shouldn't because you have now a system that was invented in the post-1945 period when the world was a very different place. It needs to be updated, it needs to be refined, it needs to take into account the current geopolitical realities that exist. Power has shifted from where it was in the 1940s to what exists now. New countries have become influential players in the international system. And I will address the question of Africa later. So we need a Security Council that is reformed, that is up to the task, that is agile, and that is not paralyzed to take the decisions that need to be taken in the interest of securing international peace and security. That is an ongoing process. We have a process called the intergovernmental process with two facilitators, one from a developed country, one from a developing country, to engage in that discussion. There are a number of models or proposals on the table about how the Security Council can be reformed. And these models are being analyzed and discussed. There are as yet no formal negotiations to that end. That will come when member states have determined that the moment is right to commence formal negotiations. But Security Council reform is at the top of the agenda of the UN and has been made so to a significant degree because of what has happened in Ukraine and in Gaza. Quite apart from that, it's not just the reform of the Council. There is also a process to reinvigorate the General Assembly of the United Nations. And if you've been following the issue, you would know that in the wake of the paralysis of the Security Council, the General Assembly, which the Charter assigns a secondary role in matters of peace and security, has in fact taken up the gauntlet and been able to agree, I think now it's 4 resolutions on Gaza. Very decisive and clear resolutions on Gaza. So the UN is not the problem. We seek to address and correct the problems. The problems arise when member states of the United Nations, for whatever reason, and I have to say this correctly, exercise their decision to violate their commitments under the Charter of the United Nations. If there were no violations of the Charter, we would not be where we are now. It is a choice that countries make to repudiate their commitments under the Charter that has landed us in this very difficult situation of war and crisis and this unacceptably high human cost that we are witnessing in Gaza. The next question that was asked was about Africa, the conflicts in Africa, and NAM's position in the conflicts.